Okay. Cool. Welcome to episode 17 of Consensus on Reality. I am still doing stuff through Zoom, so I still sound like this, I guess, to you listeners. We are here today with Stephanie Quick, a researcher, writer, paranormal person, and welcome to the show, Stephanie. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for coming on.
Ben, hi, Dave. Yeah, thanks. It's really nice to be here, Dave, to meet you, and then Ben. We met earlier through Anomaly Archives talking about Eugenia Macer's story, which was really fun.
Yeah, that was great. And maybe we'll talk about her a little bit today too. I'm always down to talk about her. She's my favorite. What do you think of the sort of current state of the world? Let's get that out of the way. From maybe from like a paranormal or mythical even, or even synchronistic angle. What do you think's going on? I mean, things are erupting, I guess, huh?
Well, it's interesting because I've always had kind of interest in the paranormal, but then also I've always been like a big kind of left-wing social justice person, and then also interested in conspiracy theory. I listened to Mae Russell and Dave Emery, like from back in the 1980s on KFJC, Foothill Junior College radio station. And, it's terrible. I've had a lot of people in my family very interested in history, and you just see these patterns that keep erupting. And if you look at the history of the United States, you see that we have these incredible founding documents that set out these very high ideals and, for better or worse, probably for better, procedures where you can actually, as you go through history, through time, there's procedures and methods, processes for bringing more people into being able to participate fully in that civic space and in those ideals, right? It has just been 100 years since the passing of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, right? And we finally have a woman in the White House.
Oh, yeah.
As VP. And it's taken that long because you have, of course, at the same time we have these incredible high ideals. We have things like the Three-Fifths Compromise, which is like, okay, people can be property and people can be cut out of participating, and we can, weight things so that certain people have a much bigger participation than other people. So you could see the set up the tension from the beginning, that we had a big, bad, horrible situation with the Civil War, and we didn't kind of do the truth and reconciliation thing. And so things slid back. You constantly have this going back and forth. And then I think we have had, since the 80s in my life, I'm almost 60 now, with Reagan and Newt Gingrich and stuff, you have a lot more money in politics and that type of corruption and more. I remember then it was like a real emphasis. We used to be, when I was growing up, we were citizens, right? With Reagan, we became consumers, right? That you're a person is not the important part. The important part is how much money you have. And we've seen that really just go completely off the rails. And we're kind of reaping the whirlwind. And, related to that, I think, is as much as we fucked up the environment and forgotten about taking care of people, this pandemic is being a lot worse than it even has to be. Although, that's another thing as far as history goes. You always have these plagues coming up. It's just part of our ecology. But we could have been a lot better prepared for it. So,
yeah, it seems like we're doing everything wrong and everyone thinks that, like, no matter how you look at it, like people that don't even think it exists, they think that it's being handled wrong, of course. And then people that do think that it exists think that we're not, so it's just from everyone's unsatisfied with whatever's happening. And then Yeah, it just seems like a time of a lot of uncertainty. Feels like the major uncertainty and like, I don't know. Yeah, maybe there's another word, but that feels like the main thing. Chaos, I guess, but it doesn't feel like productive chaos.
No, I was just speaking with my mom. Part of the thing is that we constantly have this idea of American exceptionalism. As Reagan's speechwriter used to say, like the shining city on the hill, right? But the problem is that every country is subject to these type of tensions and processes. And unless you guard against, violent overthrow, then you're open to it. And that's why, for example, Germany, after their whole Nazi experience, has very strict laws about what you can say about the Holocaust and promoting Nazis, and you can't do it. It's what's called the paradox of intolerance, right? You tolerate everything, then you can have some really intolerant views. But there's this whole idea of American exceptionalism that, well, in those third world countries or other places, you can have, for example, armed people busting into the Senate and assassinating a bunch of the elected representatives, and then whoever's left gets to take over, right?
Yeah.
There was nothing. I mean, we saw that happen in was it Governor Whitmer, that whole plot to kidnap her and lynch her. And you had in that same state, you had armed people going into, the representative bodies as they're in session. Why do you need to go in there with sub-automatic machine guns or whatever, semi-automatic, I don't know what they're called,
right.
but ones that are more than pop guns, which are bad enough.
Right.
There's only one reason to do that, but you had a lot of people trying to downplay it. Well, they're just exercising their rights. It's like, no, they're trying to terrorize these people into not voting the way they did. And you also, through this pandemic, you had a bunch of mayors, other local elected officials, and health officers who have stepped down from their positions because they have death threats and, people mobbing their homes. So I don't know why people didn't think that was going to happen, and that as coups go and attempted coups go, you have someone whipping people up, and then you have a mob, and you see what the mob does, and then you are hopefully, and I think in the incident this last Wednesday, it's pretty obvious that from testimony and from what we could see with our own eyes, that security was pulled deliberately to make those people vulnerable. And, it's irritating. One pet peeve of mine is you get a lot of kind of like academics on the left or certain analysts saying, well, really, these are people that have been deprived and that their situations aren't great, and, they don't have the same opportunities that they used to have, all of which may well be true, except for that lady who I guess flew her private jet in to be part of this mob. But not listening to what these people said, right? All these people have huge social media presences. Even the guy with the horns, people say, oh, he's Antifa. No, he's sitting there with the big old Q sign.
Right.
And all these people are saying that, they want to go find Nancy and they want to go hang Pence, right? They want to bust into the Capitol and kill people. That's what they said.
Right.
But no, we have to explain that actually it's like, no. So to me, I see it because I believe very much in process being the one thing that can save us from, I've never voted for anyone I was even remotely interested in or behind as far as policy goes. But, this incident shows process is infinitely better to just like flat out mob rule, which is where we're heading. The footage of them just pulling that police officer out and beating him is horrible.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to see that the FBI has stepped up and is tracking these people down and is arresting them and talking about bringing charges of felony murder, so that people are aware that, if you're in one of these mobs and someone gets killed, you can be charged with felony murder, and that's a capital offense as well. So hopefully people will start to take it more seriously. But yeah, it's very dicey because you have these different groups with their own power bases at play, And then you have, like you're talking about, a force of chaos, Trump, who's just like heavily implying all this stuff, all these small factions whipping themselves up and making their own plans. And you don't really know which way it's going to go. I really doubt Pence thought that they would be building a gibbet for him when he went over there to certify the electoral college vote, right?
Yeah.
But that's the thing about mobs. You really never know how it's going to go. And these are the people who've been saying Blue Lives Matter for years on end now. And they're like, okay, we're going to fucking kill you. Here you go. It's crazy. Yeah. That's why you don't want to go there, because things can get really out of hand, and it's very rarely positive change for the average person. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. Yeah. I feel like we might be getting an echo. Am I getting an echo?
I heard a little bit of something. I think it's also just the fact that, post-truth is such a cliche at this point, but I think it's just the fact that it seems like on both sides, most people have lost faith in any sort of objective reality for good reasons, because, of, obvious corruption and infiltration of finance into the government, that there is no official story anymore. If there is any official story, it's so splintered and fractured that nobody wants to have anything to do with it. So now you have all these separate, disparate reality tunnels going on, and they're just cycling and filtering, creating these feedback loops. It's definitely a very strange time. I'm not sure how we're going to get out of it, but hopefully, I don't know, hopefully you're right, and hopefully, process will be a ladder to get out of the current situation. We'll see.
Yeah.
So maybe, it feels important to at least touch on that stuff a little bit, just because it's still so present, and as we're recording this, we're still, a little ways out from the inauguration and that sort of stuff. But but I guess to get into something a little more or less sour, maybe. When I asked you or approached you for to do an interview, something you thought would be interesting to talk about was this sort of occultist, Ida Craddock, right?
Yes, Ida Craddock.
So do you want to maybe tell our listeners who that is and what's her deal?
Yeah, and actually there is an overlap and intersection with our current situation, as it turns out, which I didn't realize would be the case when we had been discussing this. But I've been interested in her for quite a while. She is one of those people. She was a woman who was born in 1857, and she grew up in Philadelphia. Her mom was a spiritualist. This is kind of like around the time of the burned over district, and that awakening had been happening. So there's like spiritualism. Her mom would do some automatic writing and some Ouija board stuff, that type of thing. But the kind of short and sweet version is that Ida, she was very precocious. She grew up professionally. She was a stenographer. She taught stenography, and she wrote a textbook on stenography. She was supported many times by her mother, this is an interesting overlap with Pascal Beverly Randolph, who was interested in marijuana. Because Ida's mother had a patent medicine that was a cannabis base. And so she sold that for like 40 or 50 years. She sold this medicine. That was how that made their living. But Ida ended up becoming very interested in sex reform, meeting with a lot of people who were involved in free thought, which was, kind of the idea that you have free speech, but also that you could be questioning religion. social reforms related to sex. She was very interested in women having more of a voice sexually. And she was doing this at the time when, because here's one of the intersections is the whole censorship issue. There was a guy called Anthony Comstock, and there was something called the Comstock Laws, which people may or may not be familiar with. But he started in 1873 the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, which was a private moral enforcement squad that was kind of funded by the government and given kind of certain legal leeway with the government. He was able to set up this private squad where they monitored the males, and anything having to do with sex, birth control, God forbid you mention abortion, or even just talk about how a married couple could have a more satisfying sex life within the bonds of holy Christian matrimony. Nothing about that. He claimed to be responsible over his career for 4,000 arrests and 15 suicides because he was a vindictive, awful, well, she nailed him at the end of her life. He was basically a sexual sadist who I think got off on reading all this stuff and prosecuting these people. So this was kind of the background. This had been going on for a while. She ended up becoming more outspoken about the issues of sex in 1893. Now, she'd had some things published before about the religious sexual symbolism in Alaska and, kind of general writings. But in 1893 was the Chicago World's Fair. And she went there, and like a lot of people, she saw they had ladies there doing belly dance, because they had all these pavilions from different countries around the world. Now, Comstock had been, let's say, shitting himself because it's, of course, completely immoral and controversial. And this is not like anything today. They're pretty much completely covered up. But, the movements were so suggestive and so sensual that Comstock was trying to work all this up. Now, at that time, people were starting to get not so into him. And he had a lot of pushback from people who had seen this and said, well, it seems to be very, it's interesting culturally, and there's nothing untoward about it, that, it's like, leave people alone. This is fine. But he was still pushing for it to be shut down because he just wanted to stamp out sex all over America at any point. So he had written about this, and then there was a new place called the New York World. It's not a place, it was actually a periodical or a paper, and they published a bunch of letters in response to his call to censor this dance. And Ida Craddock wrote a response, which was published, and this basically ended up putting the target on her. Because she wrote very movingly. She was had been at this point studied a lot of mythology and religious history. She had been attending a Unitarian church for a while and had a lot of intellectual discussion and conversation with people about all these different issues that were going on. So she talked about, I think she had like a kind of a spiritually awakening experience watching the belly dance, because I don't know if you had read Robert Monroe's work. He talked about his out-of-body experiences. But he talks about a method of communication that he calls the ROTE, R-O-T-E, or he has all these acronyms, Related Organized Thought Energy. So it's kind of like nonverbal communication where they just kind of toss you this ball that comes at you one at once, and then you can unspool it, and it has all this information in it. I've had this same experience with my own, the entities I met through my own near-death experience. It's very odd, but very interesting, and you can learn a lot of interesting stuff. And I think that she had a similar experience watching this dance, because suddenly she's like looking at the tassels and seeing the symbolism of the fact that, you have to, she believed that you would be, not having sex, like during the time of a woman's menstrual cycle. And then once that's over, in her view, and she ended up talking with a lot of people too, she thought that was when the woman would most desire sex, so that you have like the celebration. So she's like seeing in the movements, everything about it. She's like has this whole kind of erotic, mystical, symbolic understanding about how men and women can relate to each other in marriage and in sex in a way to awaken the mystical connection to the divine through watching this dance. And she speaks about it incredibly eloquently in this letter. And she's also incredibly high-minded, very uplifting always in all of everything that she's writing. So she got this letter published, which was bad enough. But, and I think this is the one thing that sealed her fate, because Comstock ended up basically hounding her to death over the next about 10, 20 years. But she writes at one point, I forget exactly how she puts it, but she says, you can tell the people who are high-minded and don't have a problem with sex because they'll sit there and they can appreciate the beauty of this, but you can tell the people who don't because they kind of go pshaw, ejaculate precipitously and leave. So she's not... And this is like in 1893 where she's saying, yeah, these guys can't, last for more than 2 seconds. That's their problem with this. So yeah, you can see why she got in trouble.
Yeah. Is that... Is the Comstock person? I mean, I definitely know the name. I wonder if he's this. I'm a big fan of this writer James Branch Cabell, who is a fantasy and sort of literary writer in like the late 19th and early 20th centuries ish, and one of his books was put before like an obscenity thing. I feel like that when did he die, Comstock? Do you know? Or
Comstock ended up dying about 1915, but his reign of terror, or error as it was, came to an end about 1902 or 1903.
Interesting. So it must have been a different guy then, because but the same New York obscenity tribunal thing is who sort of went after this book by Cabell. Yeah, that whole thing is interesting.
Yeah, because I'm gonna spoil it a little bit before, but in 1902 he ended up hounding her to the point. Ida ended up being committed to a mental institution for 3 months. They're like, well, she's fine, so we have to let her go. She ended up going to the workhouse for 3 months, and she was in her mid-40s, and the conditions back then were seriously brutal. And so he had arrested her twice, and she had been found guilty again in this fantastic trial where, of course, the things that she had been distributing were so obscene that the jury couldn't read them themselves. So the judge just told the jury, these materials are obscene, and if anyone mails obscene materials, you must find them guilty. So that was the type of trial she got. Yeah. She couldn't even have any people testify in her favor. So she knew she was going to be sentenced. So she sat down, she wrote 2 letters, one to her mom and one to the public, and committed suicide. She died by suicide. Turned on the gas and slit her wrists. But she would deliberately martyred herself because she really believed that in free speech. She really believed that people needed access to accurate information about sex. And she thought, Comstock was being so horrible that she thought this was her only way forward. And she figured she would probably die in prison anyway because conditions were really bad back then. And as it happened, she had so much public support, and her life had been so exemplary that public opinion turned against Comstock. And within a year, he'd had a nervous breakdown, and he had lost all his funding.
Wow.
So it worked.
Yeah.
And so that's why we all owe her an incredible debt, because if you're able to get birth control, if you're able to, forget porn, if you're able to go on like Planned Parenthood and find out about how to protect yourself from venereal disease, if you know that if you're a woman, you should pee after sex to avoid an UTI, right? That you get that information because she died to expose him for what he was and to help break that momentum. on that. So that's a little bit of a spoiler as to how that went down. But she ended up publishing more about this this whole her insights into the spiritual, mystical, religious symbolism, sexual symbolism of the belly dance. And at the end of it, this article, she said, well, people may wonder how it is that I'm an unmarried woman, that I would know all of this stuff about sex. Well, it's been because for the last year, I have been the lawfully married wife of a ghost. And so I have learned about the marital relation because we have, relate to each other as husband and wife do. So she just kind of like drops this bombshell at the end.
Yeah.
Like, what? People are still like, what? Over 100 years later. Yeah, so she just kind of, everything about that was just like a big old bombshell where people are just like scandalized everyone on multiple levels. But it's fascinating to me. If people are interested in Mitch Horowitz's work on Occult America, he actually has, they're still up. They're very old, but they're still great interviews with Greg Kaminsky on occult personality. He has a couple of ones on Occult America. And so Horowitz talks mostly about, for example, secret societies, lodges, and their influence through their philosophy and everything. But the other aspect of Occult America is you have people that get into contact with these spirit guides or discarnate entities, and it's very influential to them about how they act in the world to try and create a better reality for other people. Mitch Horowitz has another, he's spoken about the public universal friend, who was a woman who ended up becoming very ill, and then when she recovered, she was the public universal friend, who was just this entity that was working towards equality and social justice, against racism, against sexism, the idea that we could all be people and we could all have civil rights and participate. It's interesting because I forget at the time that the public universal friend was going around, but Horowitz makes the point that in like the 1800s and stuff, it would be very scandalous for a woman to become a public speaker in a lot of ways, except for if a woman was speaking about the moral side of society and calling people towards these type of higher moral standards, for speaking about these. For like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, that wasn't so scandalous. Still kind of scandalous. It wasn't quite so scandalous because they're talking about, okay, here are how we can become better family members and take better care of children and families as Christians. And Ida Craddock is fascinating because, you know, she's a free speech martyr. She is a martyr towards sexual freedom. She's a martyr for sexual agency among women. And this was before women could vote or anything, that she even died. You know, she was able to speak in this way and be heard because she was, you know, very upright, very uplifting. She was always talking about union with the divine and how this could make us more moral. She was talking about how having a more satisfying, less stressful sex life for families would result in more stability in society. She was also very interested in male continence. She ended up developing a whole kind of system of sexual or erotic mysticism with various stages, which is kind of similar to like Randolph or the OTO. Hers was less magical and more about attaining mystical union with the divine. But we have to put it into context at the time, which was, you know, birth control was illegal, and there was a lot of concern about the clitoris or masturbation. Gosh forbid about, you know, gay people. Poor Oscar Wilde. You know, all this stuff was very fraught. So the approach that a lot of people took to this angle was the whole idea of male continence, right? Which is having sex without ejaculation. But, and this is practiced like in the Oneida community. You also have like free love as far as, people sharing partners and stuff. But what is interesting is that, so it's partly just like as a means to birth control, but then there's also this angle of, if you, like as a sex magic or mystical technique, right? You hold off on orgasm, you kind of delay that, and then you have all this energy and a possibility for popping into these altered states of consciousness, or if you want to channel or practice remote viewing or anything that you want to do, it's going to be more available. But the other thing is that she taught a system where it's possible for men to not ejaculate, but experience the sensation of orgasm. So you kind of have like the best of both worlds, especially back then when you could not practice birth control. So, and then the other reason that I suspect that a lot of these systems involve these kind of like long, drawn out erotic situations back then. Later on in her life, she ended up, at first she, wrote about the belly dance. She got hounded actually over to Britain because her mom wanted to capture her and throw her in an insane asylum. So she had to escape to Britain and live with some people over there. There was a guy who wrote a book called, was running a periodical called Borderlands. He was a spiritualist, and she met some theosophists as well. So she had like the British Library over there, all this theosophical people, a bunch of exciting people as far as all this stuff. She ended up writing a book called Heavenly Bridegrooms. That book, some more information about her, I believe her book Psychic Wedlock, and some more of her other writings are available online, sponsored by, I think it's the OTO that runs the website, but it was a guy called Veer Chappelle who wrote a book about her, which I have. It's called Sexual Outlaw, Erotic Mystic, The Essential Ida Craddock. And it has all these materials there, but you can read a great body of her work online. But she ended up kind of collaborating. She had a number of spirit guides besides Soph, who was her husband. Another guy called Isis, I don't know how to pronounce it. And he really helped her to kind of like a combo thing, helping her write this book, Heavenly Bridegrooms. But it goes through history and across cultures, all these instances of humans having these marital relationships with discarnate beings of all different types. She has a awesome story in there of like a 14th century abbess who was wedded to a gnome. He met her when she was like 12, and he delighted her, and she made him happy. And so they were together, and she ended up becoming an abbess. And then it turned out that they couldn't really no one wanted to do anything about it because all these miraculous things happened. She was very upstanding and pure, and did a lot of good works and everything. So and it's one of the things that she finds as a continuing theme with these relationships is that, what she recommends is that you need to have someone who is chaste and upright and moral and has a pure heart and is always looking towards God, even though you're having it's like screamingly wild sex at this kind of thing. We have to be thinking about God.
Wow.
So, so she wrote this whole book, but I kind of suspect that so after she wrote that book, she ended up coming back to the United States, and she was very driven, and this is starting, I think, in the late 1890s. She was very driven to share the information that she had developed with other people. So she started seeing clients privately and speaking with them orally about all this information, which was not illegal. And she developed like 87 case studies of people that, were having sex problems. And she saw all walks of life. She ended up having a lot of defenders and people that appreciated her work among doctors and psychiatrists, lawyers, all type of professional people. she had a number of her papers were published in like medical journals because there was none of this type of information out there, and it was, very fraught even for, like a doctor to talk about these things. But and she also, this is interesting, but like 40 years before Kinsey, she had like a diagnostic questionnaire that she would give to people about their sex lives and everything. So she was very ahead of her time. I can't tell you, if you read any of her stuff, she is really smart and incredibly, she reminds me of Eugenia Macer's story, where it's just like the more you look, the more it's like, wow, this one little speck of her life is like more than I could ever hope to know.
Yeah.
But I think another reason why she was big on dragging things out, especially before penetration, is because, like vagina penetration, is because, this was before you could buy a 55-gallon drum of, water-based lube and have it delivered to your door, right? This was before you could go, find out any information for yourself. And this is before antibiotics. And women could be injured. She talks about, some pretty horrible stuff in this book, because infant mortality and maternal mortality was very bad at this point. This is kind of like the germ theory wasn't quite so much a thing at this point. Sanitation. They didn't have antibiotics. She talks about, she wrote a pamphlet called The Wedding Night about, if you're going to have sex, this is kind of what things you can do so that you can both have a good time, and also to avoid things like she talks about, because there's this kind of tradition that's like, well, she should be a virgin, and you just kind of like ram in there. And she talks about one woman who was in bed with vaginal abscesses for 6 weeks after her husband tried this on her because, right, you didn't have lube, and if you, rape someone, you can injure them, who knew? But yeah, and this is before antibiotics. So, I mean, women could die. She talked about another horrible situation where she was in a maternity ward. A woman had just given birth, and it was a very difficult birth, and it was just a few hours afterwards, and her husband was in the ward raping her. And back then, and actually until like the 70s or 80s in America, you could rape your wife if you were a man, and there was no consequence, right? It was not illegal, consent was not a thing. I think that's why people get worked up about it these days, because it was not, it was in my lifetime. I remember I was a young woman before they started passing laws that, guess what? You can be charged with rape if your wife does not consent. So, I think this is another reason why people at the time were very concerned with kind of drawing things out so it would be more liable that the woman would be ready physically for sex, and why they'd be concerned with, men not ejaculating because, women had bad mortality as far as maternity and stuff. And I think it's kind of terrible because you read her and she's very, very much of her time in that, how do I want to say, she has, you don't want to have masturbation. You really need to have orgasms through the vagina, not the clitoris. Of course, now we know that the clitoris is kind of a much larger structure than just the head, right? I don't know if people know this. You can look online, but if you think of like a wishbone with the kind of arms hanging down, right?
Getting into anatomy class.
If the vagina was having a friend over to visit, those arms would be giving the friend a hug. That's it, right? It's a much larger structure. So they were worried about these type of things back then. And there is, of course, at that strain, there was also kind of a strain of eugenics, right? Certain people should be having babies, certain people should not. So you can read some of her things, you kind of think, well, is it getting a little bit eugenic? But the thing is, she's mostly recommending that people be able to plan to have a good environment in which to raise a child, right? And that you have a proper time after a baby is born so that people can take care of it well, instead of, if you just had back then, you could have, people getting giving birth, and then bammo, they're just pregnant again immediately, and you don't have money for it. The child is going to suffer. The family as a whole is going to suffer. So that was the thing. So she kind of had these kind of 2 chapters of her life where she really concentrated on the whole kind of mystical, spiritualist, occult side of her ideas about sexual and erotic mysticism and how that was. And then later on, she had years of working with her private clients, a lot of them. And that's what got her in trouble, because she ended up, she was very concerned with getting that information out, and she felt it was wrong not to. So she ended up mailing out pamphlets and distributing her pamphlets. I mean, at one point, she ended up having a plea deal, and her mom had made a secret deal that she had to get thrown into an insane asylum for 3 months. But also part of the deal was that all of her pamphlets, all of her books that she had printed had to be burned. So you had actual literal book burning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's kind of her deal on that. And then, as I said, the last about 2 or 3 years of her life, Comstock just really came at her. And she ended up, in the end, she fought very hard. Actually, Clarence Darrow, the very famous lawyer, represented her at one point. And got her a plea bargain, another plea bargain.
Yeah.
But, she got hounded out of towns. She had to escape the country a couple of times. And then in the end, she deliberately martyred herself, and she pulled it off. And so we were the beneficiaries. So I don't know if you want to, I want to say drill down, but that seems kind of crass.
Yeah. That's like I love these people in history that their life stories are very these deep sort of, maybe archetypal is the wrong word, but just these very charmed sort of things where, I'm sure living that life would have been hell a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. But looking back on it, it has this sort of almost mythic, really sort of glowing quality to it. I don't really, yeah.
No, yeah. Mythic, I think, is a great word. And she, it's fascinating too, because I've been thinking a lot about this recently, the whole idea that you have these people that have these really out there experiences, because the people around her are well, it seems like she has this relationship with her spirit husband and her spirit guides, and she kept diaries for years of all her spiritual experiences, and a number of different experiences with Soph, which are really kind of charming to read, because I always think about people, it's this idea that sex magic, a lot of the people that are public about it tend to be, who's the Xena who's married to Nicholas Schreck?
I'm not sure. Yeah.
I think it's Anton LaVey's daughter.
Oh.
I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But she's very beautiful and super sexy and glamorous, and she has this kind of hard, almost dangerous edge to her, and it's this very performative, super kind of goth, spooky, satanic thing. And so it seems very difficult to obtain, because you're just kind of I'm just kind of some normal slum over here. How can I get involved? But I love that she, is very uplifting, and she's just, she's just a little, Edwardian, kind of with her hair in a bun, and very, nice looking, but no great shakes. And then when you read her accounts of her encounters with her husband, it's cute, because she'll talk about, she was trying to hold off, but then she couldn't quite. She kind of came a little bit, but in spite of herself, but then she kind of got so you see, even her, she's going at it for years on end, and she's still well, I did my best, but then it seems a lot more attainable for a normal person somehow.
Yeah. Was she ever part of any occult orders or anything? Or was she sort of more admired by them later on? Or
I think she was more admired by them later on. She ended up corresponding with and working with and knowing a lot of people who were involved, like that guy who did the Borderlands I think I forget what his name is. Now I don't know where I put my glass. Oh, here they are. And she, let's see. She ended up, I think it was Foote. Foote was one of her benefactors, and it was Stead who employed her over in London and was involved with that. So she knew a lot of these different people. I don't know. They don't mention that she had like taken initiation into any occult groups. Mm-hmm. She kind of got like the big initiation through making these connections with these spirit teachers, which I think is another kind of fascinating angle, because we always think about the groups and belonging to a group as being the big thing. But I think with a lot of these things, a group can be a doorway to contact, but the contact is the real initiation. And I think sometimes people lose sight of that. So she knew a lot of these people. She corresponded with a lot of them, but she didn't really do that. She had set up at one point, she met this guy who was like the first Zoroastrian person who set up a Zoroastrian church in the United States. And she ended up setting up kind of a small school of yoga where she was instructing people more like kind of meditation and breathing and energy work and different styles of consciousness. But I don't think that she, as far as I know, she's never took an initiation into any of these occult groups, which is fascinating because she studied, meditation, levitation, divination, scrying, automatic writing, Ouija board, all these different types of things, but she never was a group member.
Yeah. Interesting. I want to eventually read some of those writings. I'll look into that. I think some of our listeners will probably be interested in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. For shining light on that history that's probably not spoken about as much as it needs to be. It's really interesting.
Yeah. So maybe, we can move on, talk a little bit about... I don't know. What should we talk about next? I think maybe I wanted to talk a little bit about your work, sort of studying synchronicity and stuff like that. Or we could, of course, talk a little bit about Eugenia Mazur's story, but maybe, I'll leave it up to you.
Well, I could just tell people a little bit if you want. It's funny because I started a blog about the esoteric side of my life a couple of years ago, and I didn't think that I had, I thought, I've been keeping up, but I haven't been really blasting out. And I saw that I posted 57 different posts already, so I guess I've been a little more productive than I thought. But I've been interested in synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence, for the better part of 20 years now. And when I first got interested in it, I was just reading this book about it. I actually got interested in it at trying to get them started as kind of an experiment to try and drum up more synchronicity. This guy talked about the idea of it in this book, the name of which I've forgotten. It was like an old book at the library, and they had decommissioned it very soon after I read it, and so I haven't really been able to chase it down yet. But I have had a lot of medical problems over the years, and I've had a couple times that I'm pretty close to dying, and every time when I was really sick like that, when things would turn around, I would have some type of numinous, mystical experience, like when I had my near-death experience, and other similar visionary experiences. So at this time, I hadn't been married that long. I was, I don't know, my late 30s, early 40s, and I had developed a really bad problem with my leg. I could barely walk without taking like a couple Vicodin. I had troubles driving. I mean, even trying to go out and do errands with my husband, I would just be crying because the pain was so bad and my leg was like really, it didn't work right. And I couldn't get a diagnosis, which was very bad because, if you don't know what's wrong, you have very few options for getting anything happening. It was really, it was to the point where I was considering, how do I suicide and make it look like an accident so that my family doesn't feel bad, but I can't live like this, right?
Yeah.
So I read this book and I thought, this is interesting because this guy says you can just get synchronicities going just by paying attention to them.
Yeah.
And I got the idea that I could kind of bring some of that same kind of numinous energy into my life around this problem by trying to drum up synchronicities. I don't know why I had that idea, but I did. And I thought, well, I'm not doing anything else. And all you have to do is pay attention.
Yeah.
So for about a month before I was going to see a neurologist about this issue, I was trying to pay attention to synchronicities. And I got some good ones going. And then the day of the appointment was in the afternoon. So in the morning, I took a couple of Vicodin and I went on my daily walk. And I was coming up to this rise and I saw my neighbor who was like a Mary Kay sales lady. So she always knew everyone. Her little dog Biscuit, and then like a new dog that she was walking towards me, and I saw him, and then something distracted me, and I looked away, and then when I looked back, she and the new dog were there, but Biscuit had turned into kind of like just like a kind of a translucent white cube, and then they all disappeared. And then after a number of seconds, she came over this crest. I saw her with this new dog. It turned out that Biscuit had died. So I'd seen a couple, like a lady doppelganger, a dog doppelganger, and a ghost dog.
Yeah.
So that's why I call my blog Ghost Dog is a Mystery Box, because of that incident. So that afternoon, I went to the neurologist and I finally got a diagnosis, which is that I had nerve damage. So this got me interested in synchronicities and the whole idea of trying to get them going. I don't know, several years later, this is probably about 4 or 5 years ago now, Steve Ray and I were fellow members in a Radio Mysterioso podcast fan book. And back then he was, Greg Bishop, the host, was doing a live show. So Steve's like, you want to do an experiment? We can try and get synchronicities happening on the live shows. We'll choose a target and just only communicate in private over electronic means. So everything will be time and date stamped, and we'll see what we can do. So we did that experiment over many months, and we had some good results again on that. And since then, and that was that great design that Steve had. It was funny because he had the whole idea of doing it in secret and doing it electronically, so you have the time and date stamp. And it's funny because 3 years ago, Jacques Vallée, the famous computer scientist and ufologist, was giving a big, like, rubber chicken dinner speech for the IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And he actually mentioned the same technique. He said, this is the beauty of the internet is that you can time and date stamp everything. So if you want to do these types of experiments, and I thought, yes, exactly like Steve said. So that was fun. But since then, I have been involved in doing more of these synchronicity experiments to see just kind of how things come out, how meaning seems to flow through these things, or these clusters of synchronicities. I've been trying to get ones over the last couple of years that are stronger in that they have more a digital trail of things happening in real life. So I've had ones involving like There's one called Danger Bridge, if you want to look it up on my blog. And I had these synchronicities that were kind of pointing towards this time when we had this firestorm breakout here in our area. And it turned out that 3 different groups of people who I'm very close to, family and friends, ended up being on the bridge or very near the bridge in Vallejo that the firestorm blew across, which was super scary, which was very unusual. So that's like a real world event, but I ended up having a digital backup communication saying that happened, as opposed to just kind of like, seeing things show up on your timeline or something, which could be fun and can actually be useful, like a library angel. So I've just been doing more of that type of work. It relates to Eugenia Macer's story, because she was also talking about, okay, what do synchronicities have to say about how meaning appears in our world and the kind of structure of various dimensions and whatnot. But the weird, excuse me, that's the dog. The weird, you can see him back there, very tiny. The weird thing for me is that I've noticed, because I started as kind of a way to learn about synchronicity and meaning as it relates to these kind of, because it tends to pop up synchronicities around, for example, flying saucer contact, alien contact, ghost hauntings, poltergeist incidents. So I was thinking this could be a way into the paranormal, because it's like easier to get these happening, but obviously they kind of partake somehow of the same circumstances or energy. Right. So it could be a way to find out about this. Also, the role of meaning is very important to people who have these strange experiences that are always asking, what does it mean? Right. But I've noticed over about the past year and a half that in a way I want to get synchronicities that have, it's kind of like I'm doing it as more as kind of like an art project. Like I like to have kind of like a certain aesthetic to it as well.
Yeah.
Which I didn't even realize that too much until recently. I don't even know what it means, or if there's anyone else who's doing like synchronicity as art out there.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like if it has kind of like a certain completeness, or I tend to, in my art, I really like my photographs tend to be very kind of dramatic, and a lot of these synchronicities tend to be dramatic, although part of it's because they tend to be related to firestorms very often. I live in the Napa Valley in California, and so we've been having these firestorms. And as you know, Eugenia Macer's story has her theory about fluid ice, that certain chemical reactions facilitate psi expression, and fire is one of these reactions, right? So, so I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, she had all these sort of, what's the word? Revolved around this fluid ice matrix theory of, she spent a lot of the last decade or two of her life sort of developing these sort of this scientific theory that bridges like synchronicity and physics in this really interesting way, which is not something that I certainly couldn't explain in this podcast right now. But
it's funny because the listeners may not know, but Ben, you and I were on a panel about Eugenia Macer's story, and I was tasked with trying to explain her fluidist theory, and I kind of understood it just enough to kind of get it across in that, period of time. And after that, my brain is still kind of like, what?
Yeah.
But, she's very amazing too, because I still can't believe when we did that panel, the day we recorded it, she would talk too about these kind of weird talismans or things that she would find, like rusted talismans. And it was so weird because I was sleeping on the couch out front, and I've been meditating and stuff a long time, which is neither here nor there, except that you tend to be able to identify states of consciousness a lot more. You don't have as much, like you'll know when you're dreaming, you'll know looking back. You don't have as much that kind of holdover or bleed over between states of consciousness, stuff like that. That morning, it was I had a very, very vivid dream that, and I have, this problems with my leg and stuff originates in my pelvis, that I looked down at my pelvis and there was this little kind of a rusted, branched off kind of twig thing. It was maybe about 3 inches long, and it was kind of attached to my pelvis. And I looked down and I saw it, and I thought, that's like one of Eugenia's talismans. And I kind of broke it off and put it on the arm of this couch behind me. And I woke up and I was looking for that because I hadn't realized that I was dreaming. And it's been probably about almost 30 years since I've dreamt something like that and not realized. But that's kind of the power of Eugenia, that type of thing. And the funny thing was, I've been having a lot of trouble with my leg the couple weeks prior to that, and it was much better after that dream. So,
wow. Yeah, that's so interesting. I have also had, whenever I'm like really deep into, I'm still trying to put together this reader of her work, like selected works. And whenever I get back into sort of that realm of work, the sort of synchronicity stuff starts to ramp up again. The dream world becomes sort of stranger and more potent again. So yeah, there's something either in her work or in her life as a person that's like very connected to this this whole thing of synchronicity and whatever is going on. Yeah, I feel like that's not a big enough word for it. Synchronicity. It's like, yeah.
Cosmic Coincidence Control Center.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
Have you used the Randonautica at all?
Me? No, actually I haven't. I know about it. And I like that I'm a bird watcher, so I like that their emblem is the burrowing owl. But I haven't actually done that, partly because I have like this, well, I'm kind of like a typical person like me that you would think, because I have problems with electronics, and I have this like kind of funky old creepy phone that I'm always, it's like all of a sudden it's like one of those things. It's like all the other stuff, files that you can't like delete, have taken over your phone, and I always have apps kicking off, and I'm gonna have to get a new one in a little bit here, but
yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I think we were talking in our interview with Recluse about that. Seems like, yeah, some sort of trying to turn this kind of like questing into a game, which I feel like it's playing with fire.
Yeah.
But it also seems very useful, like a tool.
It's weird because one of the things that became really famous with that is when those, I think it was two young women who were put travel into their Randonautica. This is a few months ago, and it was up in the the Northwest. And so it took them to a spot where there was a suitcase. And they're doing it live on TikTok, and they opened up the suitcase and they found some people who had been murdered.
Yeah, I remember that.
It's fascinating to me because there's always this strain in the paranormal that these incidents want to bring up stuff that's hidden, shadow stuff, and there's always the strain of like the unquiet dead, right? Wanting to seek revenge. And I thought it was fascinating that they developed this app, and then it was used for this purpose. And around the same time, I forget the young woman's name. She was a member of the armed services, and a fellow service member murdered her. And the people in charge at the base where she had been did a really shitty job of looking out for her and trying to find her after she had disappeared, find her body. They finally found her body and found who had done it. But the fascinating thing to me was, and it was around the same time, whereas again, it's like justice comes up, But because, of course, these people found those dead bodies in a suitcase. And it turned out that this young woman who had been murdered, her body had been transported again in like a travel case. So it's like this weird, it's like this weird kind of theme of a symbol coming up in both instances. And using this kind of random app, randomization, and then this intention of justice for the dead coming through it, I thought was really weird and odd, but kind of typical of the paranormal.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a wild story. Travel. It all starts so innocent. That's terrifying.
Well, it's funny if you read George Hansen, Trickster and the Paranormal, right? He talks about liminality, which is, of course, ruled by Hermes, who is the god partly of travel, communication, right?
Yeah, and I guess he also is, at least for a little while, the psychopomp who takes you down. So the death thing comes up there too.
Yeah.
I like Hermes. I like to think about Hermes. I've been doing a lot of walking lately in neighborhoods, and I can't really read right now because of these headaches. But the last thing I was reading was a book that mentions Hermes and his role as like the sort of the boundary god, the one who sort of is the marker of boundaries. And in the neighborhood I live in, it's just, it's all houses, and I just have been like really noticing like what the ambiguities of where property lines begin and end, and thinking about like how the ancient Greeks used like little statues of Hermes to mark their boundaries, and just like this this ancient what do you call it, like obsession, I guess, with space and divvying it up. Not that that's speculation or whatever is going anywhere, but that's just what I've been thinking about lately. I don't know. I mean, I wish I had more to say about Eugenia Meser's story, EMS, but eventually I'd love to do maybe a whole episode on her work, but
I'm curious.
There's so much.
I'm curious how you archive your experiences with synchronicity and how you're organizing it before you start writing or visualizing it. And if maybe like you notice things that you hadn't noticed the first time, if there's coincidences in the threads between and stuff.
Yeah, that's partly I think this is part kind of the art angle, or so I'll kind of have times when I'm thinking, okay, I'm trying to, like I'll be shooting for a target date or time period or something. And I'll take a lot of pictures of things. I will take screenshots of things. It's nice on your phone because it has a time and date stamp on there. I will start noticing things, and then I will accumulate things. I like to have kind of images, and I like to have a clear symbol through line. And then it becomes a question of waiting until I can write it. I feel I can write it up properly because I like the writing to be a certain way. It's funny because I had done a show on synchronicity on Project Archivist, and a few months, I guess it was in July, and I just wrote it up on my blog like a couple weeks ago, I think, because I kind of felt like I had to let it cool down somehow. But I ended up I was thinking, okay, and it was, I had Rojan Razorwire was a host, and then we had David Metcalf on as a guest, and I said, okay, guys, I want you to look out for synchronicities if you can, and my intention is that I want there to be synchronicities like around the show, in the show. I want people listening to get synchronicities popping up around the show. I just want it to be like synchronicity. And I'll usually get kind of like, you have to get in this kind of weird, kind of hyped up, weird, tense kind of emotional state, about it, but it ended up being really good. If you look on the vlog, because it ended up, Rojan and I had spoken before previously. He gets telepathic empathy, which is you. I mean, telepathy is generally speaking like thoughts between people, but you can have the experience of tasting someone else's food, feeling their emotions. I have several friends that I grew up with who had this experience. It can be very difficult to kind of start to organize and notice and parse out. You can experience physical sensations, all these type of things. And he had this experience and it was very challenging for him for a number of years. He ended up getting together with a group of people who've had similar experiences, and they just kind of support each other behind the scenes. They have like even little, not little, but bracelets with a saying on them. But their kind of central mascot and theme is moths, the lowly moth. So it ended up being a situation where, and you're talking about noticing things later. Now, the day that we recorded was in July. I didn't know that the theme of moths was going to come up so strongly on that show, but I'm walking down, and part of it is just noticing unusual stuff. I'm walking down on my normal walk, and I see I go on this bike path, and the bikes and walking path, and the bikes will run over like bugs or lizards and stuff. So I kind of watch out. And there's these two moths on the path, and they're copulating, so which is unusual. So I picked them up and put them off to the side of in the bushes. God, because I felt, like how terrible they would be running.
Yeah.
On Facebook because these moths. Anyway, it ended up okay. Then I come home, and it turns out that I like that very excellent podcast, Weird Studies. Oh, it turns out they just dropped a show on Mothman. Well, that's kind of fun, Mothman. I start listening. They actually cite one of my blog posts in the show.
Oh man!
Like even better, right?
Yeah.
So we kept having all this moth stuff. There was a really fun one that happened a few weeks afterwards. A guy, Marco Acevedo, had been listening to our show, and Rojan ends up talking a lot about moths. And so David starts talking about in Mothra how you have the twin fairy princesses that are singing to Mothra in the movie. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess Marco Acevedo had listened to like the front part of the show, the podcast, right? When it first came out, but then he has a life, so he's doing other stuff. The night before, Mothra had been released on Netflix for the first time, so he watched that and he showed it to his kids, who are twins. So then he starts listening to the podcast, and the first thing that comes up is David start talking about these twins singing to Mothra. Also, Marco's a Gemini. So that's a good sync. You could see the meaning. You could see the moth. But so that was fun to happen afterwards. But then you talk about things beforehand. In the beginning of actually just about a year ago to the day, I think, I ended up in the emergency room because I think a couple weeks before, I think I'd come down with probably influenza. I had like a temperature over 100, like up to 103 for almost a week. I mean, I was really sick. So I ended up in the emergency room. Nothing's wrong, but they gave me a prescription for some anti-vertigo medicine. And then when I looked at it, when I got home, how they have that kind of dot matrix creepy printing. And I looked at it, and I swear to God, it looked like it was Dr. Mothman. But his name is Nothman.
Oh wow, that's funny.
I was like, what? I had to look. But that was like in January. We didn't have that show until July, and I didn't realize that. I mean, I kind of noticed it at the time, but I had no idea that it would be like a big, premonition to the moth.
Yeah.
And it's weird because you're thinking, how do these things manifest in our world? It seems like there's this kind of nexus around recording of the show, and that this big emotional charge coming from the moth symbol having to do with these group of empaths. But then you have these things kind of kicking off in these weird directions about, okay, when did they decide they were going to do the Mothman show on weird studies? Why did I get treated by Dr. Mothman? Oh, and then another thing that happened around that show is that I tend to, actually, it's not uncommon. I'm getting embarrassed. That's why I'm fudging at this point in time. So there tend to be paranormal occurrences and synchronicities involving underwear, right? Because you think about the paranormal, it's like emotionally charged things, right? Things that are hidden, things that are kind of maybe, right? So it makes sense that underwear would show up, right, in these things. So I've had various paranormal events and synchronicities around underwear for a number of years. And also everyone in my family likes to make fun of me around my underwear. You know, if it's ever showing, my mom will make a comment. So we're getting ready. I'm getting worked up to record this show, and I was like panicking to Rojan and my mom. I'm like, why do I have all these horrible synchronicities? And I just don't want anything involving underwear to show up because of all my So a couple days before the show, my mom's like, tee-hee-hee. She's reading the newspaper. She gets the newspaper every morning. I'm like, what? She's like, oh, there's a synchronicity in here. I'm like, what is it, Mom? She's like, oh, you have to read it. Okay, so it turns out there's these two widows in our town, and they walk along the trails and they pick up trash. So they did a profile on them in the newspaper. So they asked them at some point in the interview, what's the weirdest thing you find when you're digging around? They say, well, we find a lot of underwear. So Mom was laughing. Okay. So I start laughing when I read this, but here's the kicker. These two ladies were both married. One was married to a sheriff, and the other was married to a guy who worked for Owl Rexall. So I was recording that show with Rojan and David Metcalf, and two of David Metcalf's biggest research interests are this guy named Sheriff McTeer and the Rexall drug there in Atlanta, Georgia, which has all this folk magic stuff. So I'm like, what are the chances? First of all, they're talking about underwear, but then it's pointing to, you know, my co-host on the show. So I was reading this, I thought, that's pretty good, but there's like no fucking way I'm bringing this up on the show. I just want to avoid talking about underwear. But so then after we recorded the show, I ended up at some point, I'm like, hey, you know this thing? I ended up bringing it up, and that one of these ladies was married to a sheriff, and afterwards I'm thinking, why did I do that? But when I listened again, because I was so nervous about it, I forgot that Metcalf at some point, for some reason, I don't know why, just started going on this whole rant about this Sheriff McTeer guy. So then I was like, well, you know, then I could bring this up. But anyway, so it's like, what? I mean, that those ladies are married to their husbands, what, like probably 50 years ago. But then it it's kind of like if you have like a gravitational well, and it gets like certain meanings in there, and things, everything that is related to that meaning, it just gets like sucked in or something. It's like the strangest thing. Yeah. That's another reason why I like doing it, is like, what does it say about how our world works?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you have any advice for people, or maybe if you could talk a little bit about how you navigate extracting meaning from synchronicities, especially something like you're talking about. It's funny, like with underwear, you know, I'm wondering like if you're encountering something synchronicitous that you want to like get out of your head, but then there's like this important meaning attached to something absurd like that, you know, what do you look for? How do you navigate that?
Well, actually kind of hearkening back to Ida Craddock. My best advice for anyone trying to get out into these freaky, weird, mind-bending waters is to, first of all, strengthen your mundane realities. So you want to walk, you want to try and keep up with your chores, eat well. I think a lot of people, they think, well, if you take drugs and fast and do all this stuff, it can facilitate these experiences, which it can. But If you want to, like you say, navigate them well and be able to maintain a consistent and strong relationship with these strange experiences, you need to have that solid physical foundation. I think this is why a lot of magicians and occultists do handicrafts, because it grounds you in the material. You want to have friends, if possible, to have good relationships with the people around you. Hopefully it could be your family or your friends or your adopted families, people in the community. And then also you want to pay attention to your ethical, moral stance. I mean, none of us are perfect, but you want to do your best to be coherent, so you're not being two-faced. That's a very profound practice in and of itself, to express your values coherently through all aspects of your life. To do that as much as you can, to try and help other people, to be kind to animals.
Yeah.
To try and have a not even less harmful life, but to be trying to promote compassion and joy for other people, to have that type of strength, first of all, is very foundational. The other thing that Ida talks about a lot is clear thinking. You always want to, whenever possible, think clearly, and again, stay grounded in reality. That's something that I try and approach in terms of synchronicities. I think especially in the beginning, you want to grab it, even something that seems a little bit like it may be so, and not get so fussy about things. But for example, all those moth synchronicities, those were real live moths. I have a picture of them. That was a published piece in the newspaper. I took a picture. I had the clipping. You have the link. People can go see it. So people can go to the Weird Studies and listen to that episode where they talk about, it's about Mothman, and they're mentioning my blog. The stronger that you keep your physical grounding, when you do have these synchronicities and meanings come up, you can trace them clearly and precisely, because you have had them manifest more strongly. I think you need to have that physical base. You need to have the clarity of mind to say, there's some ones that come up that are just funny, or they could be an algorithm, and I would say pay attention to those too, but be able to keep it clear in your mind. Don't be scared to look at these things critically, and to try and confront them clearly, because then you're less likely to get sidetracked into something completely crazy. And be able to maintain your grounding, and paradoxically, it will help strengthen your ability to manifest these more confounding instances. I don't know if that helps. One other thing that I found is that there's different ways of looking at symbol, right? You can have like a word that's the same word. You can have
Froze for a second there.
a lot of instances of double.
Sorry, you're froze for a second there.
Yeah, I think it's fine now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that answer was excellent, though. Especially because I think so much of what people think about these experiences is attaining some other realm or disembodiment, or like breaking away from the body, but having this connection to your everyday life, and then sort of creating this tapestry and a thread. I think that's excellent advice, to create a web of meaning around synchronicities, which would obviously otherwise be seen as, random connections or pattern recognition or something.
And the thing is that we're meaning creatures anyway, right? We always have the realm of meaning. Like everything we're doing right now, if you don't know English, right? It's a bunch of random BS.
Right.
Yeah. Everything's constructed on language. Yeah.
And meaning.
Yep.
So this, I think it's important to, I don't want to say, to think about that we are meaning-based creatures. So we're always dealing in meaning. And there's, you can look at any incident or event from different levels, right? There's like what do I think of? Let's say you know a young person and they've applied to a bunch of colleges, right? So you see them down the street and they are at the mailbox, they take out a letter, open it up, and they start crying. Were they accepted or not? Right? You know it's the same physical event from your vantage point, but the meaning level can be kind of taken out, right? So, and this is something that once you start getting into occult or esoteric theory, is they talk a lot about different levels of reality, and you can have different things that are happening on different levels of reality. I mean, you could have like someone who breaks their leg, and it could end up just being one of those things, or it could end up being like the culmination of some type of weird synchronistic cluster about how they're overworking, and so that's what happened. You know, I mean, sometimes things just happen. Sometimes they're very meaning-laden. I mean, all we can do is grapple with it and try and remember or make explicit what our kind of thought process is about why we're making a certain argument.
Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting. Cool. I mean, that might be a good place to leave it off for now. I think that, that's a ton of information for us tonight. I love talking about these synchronicity things, people's sort of like personal like mythologies and maps that sort of build up around these. I think, and the harder you kind of lean into it, the stranger it gets too. But awesome. Yeah. So thanks again for coming on.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I was just real excited. I'm especially excited to get into Ida Craddock some, because I've been very interested in her for quite a while. Because I've had a lot of strange, erotically tinged spiritual experiences, and a lot of other people have too. So that's partly why I got interested in her. But she's just fascinating from so many angles. So thank you. Yeah,
I hope people check out her work. And so you said there's some books that are findable online.
Yeah, I'll send you the link, and then you can put it in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thanks for coming on, and we'll talk soon.
Where can our listeners check out some of your work again as well? At stephaniequick.home.blog, right?
Yeah.
And some of your visual work as well?
Yeah, I have a lot of the photography on there is mine, and a lot of writing. And if you go to the About, I have links to my Facebook and Twitter accounts, and then also my email if you want to send me weird stories. I always like to get a weird story.
Awesome. You might get them from this one. People should drop their comments too if they find any synchronicities in this.
Yeah.
So great to hear.
Awesome. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. Cool. All right. I'll talk to you soon.